The merchant stood in the center of his courtyard, his boots sinking into the dry, cracked earth. He stared down at his own hands, watching them shake with a rhythm he could not control. Every corner of the yard held the remnants of a life he was losing. The shop shutters were locked, the shelves inside bare, and the ledger on the table was filled with red ink. He tried to take a breath, but the air felt thin, heavy with the scent of dust and failure. He looked toward the gate. The latch clicked. The sound echoed against the stone walls, sharp and final. The moneylender stepped into the yard, his pace slow, deliberate, and heavy. He did not look at the merchant at first. He looked at the shop, his gaze sweeping over the property like a predator measuring a kill. He stopped 10 feet away. The merchant opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. The moneylender stood still, his presence filling the small space. The moneylender cleared his throat, the sound like dry gravel grinding against stone. He took a step forward, closing the distance until he was within reach of the merchant. "Your debt is insurmountable," he rasped, his voice cutting through the stagnant air. The merchant remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet the man's eyes. The moneylender let the silence stretch, watching the merchant struggle to find a response that would not come. Then, he turned his head slowly. His gaze darted toward the porch, locking onto the girl standing in the shadows. The merchant followed his line of sight, his pulse quickening. The moneylender smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "But I offer a solution," he continued, his tone dropping to a low, calculated hum. "If she agrees to be my wife, the debt vanishes. If not, you lose your shop and your home by dawn." He paced a slow circle around the merchant, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, forcing the merchant to pivot and track his movement. The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. The moneylender stopped, waiting for the realization to sink in, his eyes never leaving the girl on the porch. The merchant stood trapped, the weight of the ultimatum pressing down. The merchant turned his head slowly toward the porch. His skin had gone deathly pale, the color draining away until he looked like a statue carved from gray stone. His lips were pressed into a thin, white line, trembling with the effort to hold back a scream or a plea. He looked at his daughter. She stood motionless in the deep shadows, her hands gripping the wooden railing of the porch until her knuckles turned white. She did not blink. She watched the space between her father and the moneylender, her breath shallow and rhythmic. The merchant looked back at the moneylender, then down at the dust swirling around his boots. He could not pay the gold. He could not fight the man before him, and he could not bear the thought of the life that awaited his daughter if he refused. The silence in the courtyard grew heavy, suffocating. The merchant's shoulders slumped, the tension leaving his frame in a single, shuddering exhale. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement of his head. It was a silent surrender, an admission that the shop, the home, and his own pride were worth less than the alternative. The moneylender's eyes gleamed as he watched the merchant's resolve shatter. He did not speak, but his posture shifted, his frame expanding with the weight of his victory. The moneylender moved toward a patch of loose gravel near the center of the yard. His smile widened, exposing teeth stained yellow by time and neglect. He bent at the waist, his long, thin fingers clawing into the earth like the talons of a bird. The girl leaned forward from the porch, her eyes narrowing as she tracked every twitch of his wrists. He reached down, his hands sifting through the dust and small pebbles. He picked up one stone, then another, his movements deliberate and practiced. The girl watched the way his thumb pressed against the surface of the first stone, then the second. She saw his fingers curl inward, shielding the objects. He did not reach for a white stone. Instead, he snatched 2 black stones from the ground, his knuckles whitening with the effort of the deception. He stood up, his back still turned to the merchant, and dropped both stones into a small, worn leather pouch. He turned around, holding the bag open, his expression smug. The girl stood frozen on the porch, her breath hitching. She had seen the truth. The moneylender held the leather pouch aloft, the drawstrings pulled tight around his wrist. He shook the bag once, a dry, rhythmic rattling that filled the silence of the courtyard. He looked at the girl, his head tilted, a mocking invitation etched into his features. "Now, choose," he commanded, his voice raspy and low. He took a step toward the porch, extending the bag until it hovered just inches from the girl's reach. The girl did not move immediately. She stared at the dark, weathered texture of the pouch, her mind racing through the implications of the trap. If she refused, her father lost everything. If she reached in, she would pull out a black stone, and her life would be forfeit. The moneylender's eyes darted between her and the merchant, his smug expression tightening with impatience. He shifted his weight, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The girl looked at the bag, then at the man's face, searching for a flicker of mercy that she knew did not exist. Every second that passed felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She took a breath, the air tasting of dust and impending loss. She stepped off the porch, her feet finding the uneven ground. She reached out, her hand hovering over the opening of the bag. Her fingers crossed the threshold of the leather pouch, entering the dark, confined space. She felt the cold, smooth surfaces of the two stones resting at the bottom. Her skin brushed against the hard, unyielding material as she searched for a grip. She closed her fingers around one of the stones, feeling its weight settle into her palm. She pulled her hand back, the movement slow and deliberate. As her wrist cleared the rim of the bag, she did not pause. She let her fingers go limp. The stone slipped from her grasp, tumbling through the air with a soft, hollow sound. It struck the ground and vanished instantly, rolling deep into the thick, overgrown grass. It disappeared among the thousands of other pebbles scattered across the dirt. The girl gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in a display of sudden, sharp panic. She looked down at the grass, then back at the moneylender, her face a mask of wide-eyed, trembling distress. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she cried, her voice echoing against the silent walls of the house. She stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, while the moneylender stared at the empty space where the stone had been, his smug expression faltering into a look of sharp, sudden confusion. The girl did not move to retrieve the lost stone. Instead, she stood her ground, her gaze locking onto the moneylender with a sudden, icy clarity. The air in the courtyard seemed to thin, the silence stretching until the distant sound of a bird felt like a thunderclap. She gestured toward the leather pouch still clutched in his hand. "It does not matter," she said, her voice steadying, shedding the tremor of her earlier act. She took a step closer, forcing him to look down at the bag. "If you look at the stone remaining inside, we will know exactly which one I picked." The moneylender's jaw tightened. He looked at the grass where the stone had vanished, then back at the girl. His fingers, which had been so confident moments ago, now gripped the leather with white-knuckled tension. He blinked, his eyes darting to the merchant, who stood frozen in the background. The trap was set. He stood motionless, the weight of his own malice turning into a heavy, suffocating burden. He had no path forward that did not lead to his own undoing. The moneylender's hand trembled as he reached into the leather pouch. He hesitated, his fingers brushing against the rough interior, before he finally pulled the remaining stone into the light. It was black. He stared at the dark surface, his face flushing with a deep, ugly shade of red. The silence in the courtyard grew heavy, thick with the weight of his exposed malice. He looked at the stone, then at the girl, who stood waiting with a steady, unblinking gaze. If he admitted the stone in his hand was black, he would have to concede that the one the girl dropped was white. He gritted his teeth, the sound audible in the quiet air. His hand shook violently as he dropped the stone back into the bag, the impact dull and final. He looked toward the merchant, then back at the girl, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. He had been outmaneuvered by his own greed. He spat on the ground, his eyes narrowing into slits, before he turned on his heel. He did not speak another word. He marched toward the gate, his movements jagged and uneven, leaving the debt behind in the dust. The heavy wooden gate creaked as the moneylender shoved it open, his boots kicking up a final cloud of grit before he disappeared into the lane. The sound of his retreating footsteps grew faint, then vanished entirely, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the courtyard. The merchant stood motionless for several heartbeats, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. His knees buckled, and he sank down onto the hard, packed earth, his palms pressing flat against the ground as if to anchor himself to his own home. The daughter did not move to help him yet. She watched the gate, her hands finally relaxing at her sides, the tension draining from her shoulders. A cool breeze swept through the yard, carrying the scent of dry earth and coming rain. The merchant looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and he let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry away the weight of the last hour. He reached out, his fingers brushing the dust from his knees, and stood up slowly, his movements stiff but steady. The shop, the porch, the very air of the courtyard felt different now reclaimed. They stood together in the center of the yard, surrounded by the quiet, mundane sounds of the afternoon. No words were needed. The debt was gone, buried in the dust where the stones had once been. They turned away from the gate and walked toward the porch, leaving the silence behind them, finally free to breathe in the stillness of a home that was theirs once more.